Take the story of Michael, a man who lived an ordinary life on the surface. He had a job, friends and neighbors who thought of him as polite, reserved, maybe even a little shy. But late at night, Michael wrestled with a secret that was eating him alive. For years, he had stolen from his employer, taking money in small amounts, always believing he was clever enough to hide it. When investigators caught up to him, the amount was staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars gone. A man who looked like everyone else was living in the shadows of greed, driven by an impulse he could no longer control. Then, there are the confessions that shake even the most experienced detectives. Angela's case is one of those. To the outside world, she was a loving mother of two, a woman who volunteered at her children's school and baked cookies for her neighbors. But behind closed doors, her life was unraveling. Her marriage was falling apart, debts were piling up, and she was suffocating under the pressure of keeping up appearances. One night, in a moment of desperation, she made a choice that would change everything. Her husband was found dead, and suspicion immediately turned to her. In the interrogation room, she put on a mask of shock, insisting she had nothing to do with it. But detectives weren't convinced. They pressed her with evidence, questioned her inconsistencies, and reminded her of the life insurance policy she had just updated. Hours later, her voice cracked. Tears rolled down her face as she whispered, "I didn't want to do it. I just couldn't take it anymore." That confession revealed not just a crime, but the breaking point of a woman whose mask of normalcy had completely shattered. But not every confession comes with tears. Some arrive with chilling calmness, as if the weight of the crime is nothing more than a story being retold. Take Daniel, a man who had been arrested for a string of violent robberies. When detectives sat him down, they expected resistance, denial, maybe even anger. Instead, Daniel leaned back in his chair, smirked, and began to talk. He recounted each crime in detail, describing the adrenaline he felt, the fear in his victim's eyes, and the thrill of escaping into the night. His tone was disturbingly casual, as if he were talking about a movie he had watched. It wasn't about the money, he admitted. It was about the feeling. Like I was in control for once in my life. That confession chilled investigators not because of the violence itself, but because of how easily he relived it without a flicker of remorse. Sometimes confessions come long after the crime is committed, carried by guilt that refuses to stay buried. One such story involves Thomas, a man in his 60s who walked into a police station one morning and asked to speak to an officer. His hands trembled as he held a worn envelope. Inside was a letter he had written, confessing to a crime committed decades earlier. When he was a young man, he had been involved in a hit-and-run accident. A pedestrian had been killed, and Thomas fled the scene, never to be caught. For years, he lived with the secret, carrying it through marriage, children, and even grandchildren. But as time passed, the guilt consumed him. Sitting in that small interview room, he confessed everything. Tears streamed down his face as he admitted, "I've lived with this every single day of my life. I can't die with it on my conscience." His confession brought closure to a family that had waited decades for answers. But it also showed the haunting power of guilt, that no matter how far we run, the truth has a way of catching up. There are also confessions that expose the terrifying psychology of a criminal mind. One infamous case involves Richard, a man suspected of multiple assaults. Detectives spent weeks tracking him down, gathering evidence, and finally bringing him in for questioning. At first, Richard laughed off the accusations, calling them lies and fabrications. But slowly, as details were presented, his demeanor shifted. Then, shockingly, he began to speak not just about the crimes he was accused of, but about others no one had even connected to him. He confessed to acts so disturbing that investigators had to pause, stunned by his openness. When asked why he was confessing, Richard's answer was chilling, "Because I want people to know what I did. I want them to remember me." For him, the confession wasn't about guilt or remorse. It was about legacy, about leaving a mark on the world, no matter how dark it was. Not all confessions are clear-cut. Some are messy, tangled in lies and half-truths, where the criminal tries to minimize their role even as they admit guilt. Take Sarah, who was arrested for her involvement in an elaborate fraud scheme. She sat in the interrogation room, carefully choosing her words. "I didn't plan it," she insisted. "I just went along with what they told me." But as detectives pressed her, she revealed more and more details, until it became clear she had been the mastermind all along. Her confession came not in a sudden breakdown, but in a slow unraveling piece by piece until the full picture emerged. By the end, she sighed and said, "Fine. Yes, it was me. But you have no idea why I did it." Her words left investigators with an unsettling truth that confessions don't always bring clarity. Sometimes they raise even more questions about motive, about morality, about what drives someone to cross that line. And then there are the confessions that never come willingly. Sometimes the truth is dragged out, forced by evidence so overwhelming that denial becomes impossible. These confessions often end not with remorse, but with resignation. The criminal stares at the floor, mutters a few words, and accepts their fate. But even in those moments, the confession holds power. It brings closure to victims, justice to families, and a sense of truth to a world clouded with lies. The stories of these confessions remind us of something deeply human, that even in the darkest corners of the human mind, words hold power. A confession is more than just an admission of guilt. It's a window into the soul of someone who chose a path most of us can't imagine. Some confess out of guilt, others out of pride, and some simply because they can no longer carry the weight of silence. But in every case, those words change everything. So the next time you hear about a criminal confessing, remember it's not just about the crime itself. It's about the unraveling of a secret life, the collision of truth and lies, and the moment when the mask finally falls away. Because when criminals confess, the world doesn't just learn what they did. We learn who they really are. You've just heard the words that shattered lives, solved mysteries, and exposed the darkest corners of the human mind. Some confessions brought justice, others only raised more questions. But one thing is certain when criminals confess: they leave behind more than evidence. They leave behind stories that we can never forget. If these stories shook you, imagine how many secrets still remain hidden, waiting for their moment to be revealed. Until next time, stay aware, stay safe, and remember the truth always finds a way out.